the Danes declared that they have sent their 19 French Caesar 8x8 self-propelled howitzers, one of the most modern weapon systems there is in the world, and clearly a significant reinforcement of Ukraine's artillery or howitzer capabilities. And now the Danes declared that they will send even more. So when you have countries such as Denmark, and then you have countries such as the Baltic states that also practically spent 1.5% of their entire GDP on providing financial or military aid to Ukraine, it sounds very small, but when you take all of these countries taken together and then you add backing by countries such as Poland that had large quantities of Soviet-era heavy military equipment such as tanks, multiple launch rocket systems, air defense systems, and infantry fighting vehicles, many of which, such as the PT-91 Tvarde tanks, had been modernized in the 90s and early 2000s and received modern optics. This is all very significant aid. And then, of course, you have Great Britain and the US providing also very modern weapons in large quantities. So we have a situation in which the Russians, they are probably receiving some artillery shells from North Korea, and they are receiving these suicide drones from Iran. But other than that, they are quite lonely on the world stage when it comes to receiving military aid. And of course, here with Napoleon, we had a similar situation in which he was deemed so dangerous, so aggressive, that basically all the other powers of that time united against him. And as we have with Russia today, that is also being sanctioned by many, many countries. Just the day before yesterday, I believe, Poland announced that they will close the border for all freight vehicles from Belarus and Russia.
From the 1st of June, yes.
Yes. This is a form of sanctions that can be compared in a way with the Navigation Act that the British used against Napoleon, basically saying that we will launch a naval blockade against Napoleon and any country that is willing to trade with Napoleon. So then we had a similar scenario with the Germans during the First and Second World War, in which they were trying to counter these naval blockades with submarine warfare. But it turned out, both in the First and the Second World War, that simply the naval powers, initially just the United Kingdom, but later on in both wars, after the Americans joined as well, that these naval powers were too strong. And in the end, during both wars, the Germans were practically more or less starving. They were running out of all types of foods and military or machinery that could be used for military purposes. They were trying to come up with various homemade alternatives, in Germany known as Ersatz.
Ersatz, yes.
Yes. Or replacement solutions, so to say. But they greatly suffered from this isolation, and Russia today is in a somewhat similar scenario. So looking back at the Napoleonic Wars, you can draw a lot of conclusions of where this war is heading for Russia. Later on, these military revolutions and military affairs continued. We discussed in a previous episode the advent of the domination of defensive weapons during the First World War, of blitzkrieg during the Second World War, but also the way the Second World War ended, which also explains why we have not had any real large-scale peer conflicts between nuclear powers after the Second World War, simply with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which showed the world the terrible capabilities and the destructive capabilities that nuclear weapons have. If Ukraine would have been able to keep their nuclear weapons that they had up until 1994 and 95 with the Budapest memorandum that was signed, in which Ukraine gave away the nuclear weapons they had inherited after the fall of the Soviet Union, and they gave them away to Russia, together with its strategic bombing air force, for example. It is very unlikely that the Russians would have ever invaded. This also explains why the Western allies are so unwilling today to. They're willing to supply Ukraine with weapons, but they are unwilling to, for example, have American, British, or Polish fighter jets closing the skies over Ukraine, as many Ukrainians asked for during the first days of the war. It is viewed as one step too far, that creates the risk of nuclear warfare, and this also explains naturally why there is no boots on the ground from NATO forces in Ukraine. So with nuclear weapons, we had the latest real revolution in military affairs. Later on, there are those that say that in the early 90s, and especially with the American invasion of Iraq during the first Gulf War, that so-called network-centric warfare was another type of revolution military warfare, that basically warfare by that time had become computerized.
That's right.
With so much intelligence being sent by satellites, and it was
very different warfare.
Absolutely.
And I fear we've reached the end, but thank you for that. That's been fascinating.
Thank you.
There we are, the end of another programme, but I think that's been very interesting. I like these discussions where we range far and wide, because it's very important, I think, for history to draw parallels, because although history doesn't always repeat itself, it often rhymes, as I think it was Mark Twain who said. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Poland Daily History. Thank you for watching.